In this lesson, we're taking a look at different types of microphones, so you can decide which microphone is best for your voice, your project, your environment, and your budget. First, let's consider the two primary types of microphones: dynamic microphones and condenser microphones. This is an example of a dynamic microphone, the Shure SM58. It's a staple in the audio world. Anybody who's anybody in audio owns at least 1 or 10 of these. And we're going to talk plenty about this microphone as we go on. But first, let's just use it as an example of what a dynamic microphone is. So first, dynamic microphones tend to be warm, but they can also border on boomy. Warm, of course, is good. Boomy, not so much. Dynamic microphones pick up a lot less detail than condenser microphones do. Now, that sounds like a bad thing, but it really depends on what you're going for. Think about a low-res video. Of course, it's lower quality, but at the same time, it's going to smooth over all of the imperfections that our faces have, that our environment has. Compare that to like a 4K video. It's perfect and crystal clear, but all that detail brings out every crack and every pore in your skin. So it really depends on what you're going for. Dynamic microphones are generally smoother across the board, but that means they're less detailed as well. Dynamic microphones have better rejection than condenser microphones. Rejection is when a microphone is able to get rid of unwanted noises, typically background stuff coming from the opposite side of the microphone. So a dynamic microphone will generally isolate the voice or isolate the subject, whatever it is you're trying to record, better than a condenser microphone will, depending on the type, and we're going to get into that. And partly the reason it's better at rejection, besides the polar pattern, which we're going to get into in just a little bit, is that, as I said, it's less detailed, which means lots of the background stuff just isn't going to get picked up with anywhere near the clarity that a condenser microphone will pick it up, as we'll hear in just a few minutes. Dynamic microphones are much less sensitive than condenser microphones, which means they handle loud sounds better, and they can handle the change from a softer sound to a louder sound much better as well. You're much less likely to blow out or overdrive or clip on a dynamic microphone as long as you've set your initial levels properly than you are on a condenser microphone. And so in that way, dynamic microphones tend to be much more robust. You can really kind of beat them up and throw them around, whereas condenser microphones, they don't handle a beating. You have to be very gentle with them. Dynamic microphones are subject to something we call the proximity effect, which means if you get closer to it, the microphone really enhances the bass quality in a sound source, especially a human voice, which is why dynamic microphones are almost always used for that radio sound. You can probably hear it right now. This is that warm, smooth, buttery, beefy low-end radio or podcast sound. So if that's what you're going for, dynamic microphone is definitely what you want to look into. Okay, now let's contrast a dynamic microphone with a condenser microphone. I have switched over to the SM86, which is a small diaphragm condenser. As you've probably noticed already, condenser microphones are crispier, but that also means they could be harsh, right? So whereas dynamic microphones are warm, but they can go to boomy, condenser microphones are crisp, but they can border on harsh. And one of the reasons that they have that crispy sound is that they are much more detailed. So condenser microphones are more like that 4K video. They're going to pick up everything. Every lip smack, every little noise your face makes when you brush your hair out of your face. And that also means they're typically not as good at rejecting unnecessary background noise. They're much more likely to pick up stuff in the background that you don't want heard. In fact, in my previous house, in my previous studio, I had a clock hanging on my wall, I don't know, about maybe 4 or 5 feet kind of this way from where, as if this was the old studio, it was about right over there on the wall. And it was a real clock with a second hand that had a very, very, very faint tick to it, that standard clock ticking noise. When I used to record in that studio with a condenser microphone, I had to take the clock out of the studio and put it in a separate room and close the door every single time I recorded, because the condenser was so detailed that it was picking up that ticking in the background and it was ruining every single video. And so on that note, condenser microphones are more sensitive. They are not going to handle loud noises or the difference between quiet and loud nearly as well as a dynamic microphone is, which means you have to be super careful when you set your input levels, when you set your incoming gain, which we're going to get to later in this course, right? This is kind of a general overview in this lesson. So don't worry if you hear a few terms you're not quite sure of yet. They're coming as we go. I'm going to come back to these terms over and over and over again, so don't worry. One of the core differences between dynamic and condenser microphones is that condenser microphones all require phantom power, which not every recorder has. As I mentioned earlier, these are a lot more delicate. Condenser microphones cannot take a beating. If you drop this, it's liable to break, whereas a dynamic microphone, that Shure SM58 over there, you can use that as a hammer and nothing will happen to it. And I've seen audio engineers use it as a hammer when they couldn't find one, and they're fine. As long as we're talking about condenser microphones, it's really worth discussing the difference between a small diaphragm condenser and a large diaphragm condenser. As I mentioned, the SM86, is a small diaphragm condenser. Small diaphragm condensers are tight, detailed, and focused sounds. And they also produce a lot less self-noise, the amount of noise generated by the microphone itself. Whereas a large diaphragm condenser, like this Groove Tubes microphone right here, by the way, I love this microphone. These tend to be warm and rich, but they also generate more self-noise. In fact, when I was setting the input gain just a few minutes ago to set this microphone up, I could actually see, even when the room was dead silent, the levels were pegging low. They were low, but they were pegging in a way that I couldn't see when I was using the small diaphragm condenser, which means this microphone is generating a lot more of its own noise than the small diaphragm was. When you find condenser microphones in radio or broadcast environments, you typically find large diaphragm condensers like these, as I'm sure this image right here is something you've seen many times before. You benefit from the warm, rich sound that you would kind of get from a dynamic mic with the proximity effect, but you also get the detail of all the sibilance, and you get a lot more clarity in the voice. But you also pick up a lot more of the background noise, just like any condenser would. Little coffee break. Gotta love the Figment mug. Okay, so what are my recommendations when it comes to dynamic versus condenser microphones? Well, a good rule of thumb is to choose a dynamic microphone for podcasting and voiceover work. You should also choose a dynamic mic when you need a handheld mic on the road and you really need to be able to throw it into bags and whip it back out and not worry too much about it breaking. In that case, the SM58 sitting back here right now is going to be really, really beneficial to you, and I'm going to be doing a whole video on that later in this course. Meanwhile, consider using a condenser microphone for on-camera uses, for run-and-gun vlogging, and for tightly controlled studio environments like the one I'm in right now.